Islamophobic or anything like that. For Muslims, Islam is the first loyalty. Unfortunately, we, in our outdated model, outdated frame of reference of nationalism, do not realize that frame of thinking of Muslims is different. They are a civilizational citizen of Islam. They be in India, they be in Pakistan, they be in Turkey, they be in Europe. They are civilizational citizens of Islamic civilization. Namaste, and thank you for joining me today on this talk. The Hadis of INA or Azad Hind Fauj. So Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and in particular INA, the Azad Hind Fauj, they have been subjects of much inspirational, heroic, almost beyond life proportions in the Indian psyche. For obvious reasons, they on one hand stand for that valor, that bravery, that untiring patriotism that never was subdued. In a way, it was rekindling of the flame which was lit in the 1857 War of Independence. In a way, INA was simply a continuity of that spirit. And on the other hand, INA also gave a new channel after 1942. If we study the history of the independence movement, the independence movement was almost done. There was nothing left after Quit India movement of 1942, to paraphrase Professor R.C. Majumdar. And therefore, INA provided for the entire Indian nation that new channel, that energy which had no other means of fighting for independence, got attached to INA. And then there is another reason why INA and Azad Hind Fauj remain subjects of much myth-making. On this point, a little bit more deliberately. It is the secular history writing project. So, the INA story, the mainstream narratives, which you often hear about both in textbooks and in popular literature, it creates kind of a make-believe that at least one place in our independence movement in the Indian history we have where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, everybody marched arm in arm with camaraderie for one common goal of liberating the Mother India. So that secular ideal, that secular dream almost seems to be coming true in the image of INA. It is perhaps because of these reasons that it is a difficult task for us to broach perhaps some unpalatable, uncomforting questions. It is also perhaps, however, important for us to scratch the surface a little bit and look at the details, no matter how uncomforting or unpalatable they may be. And that difficult task is the subject for today. Today we are going to look at some uncomfortable facts about Indian National Army, INA, or Azad Hind Fauj. Our purpose is not criticizing the revered great leaders or personality involved. It is to learn some lessons from the energies and from the dynamics of the time that was going on, because perhaps by looking at it without any colored glasses, we may be able to gain some insight about when our present. So with that, we are all pretty familiar with how having won the second term in the Congress party as president, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was forced to resign from the post of the head of Congress. That election, the second term that he won, we all also familiar, was bitterly fought within Congress party. He won by defeating declared Gandhi candidate Pattabhi Sitaramaiah. He won with a handsome margin, and it almost polarized Congress party. Then, moving quickly forward, he had to leave Congress. He had to recreate his politics in Bengal. He created Forward Bloc, started doing various activities of creating a separate pillar, almost a left-wing pillar of the Congress, etc. And then, fast forward, the heroic escape of Bose from his house arrest, in which he escaped by disguising himself to first Afghanistan, reached Kabul, and eventually he reached Germany. That all is the glorious story is pretty familiar and pretty inspiring to all of us. But when before Bose reached Germany, Europe, particularly the Berlin and Rome, Nazi and Nazi powers, they were already allied with global pan-Islamists for a while. So when Bose arrived in Germany, Europe was a bastion of most of these pan-Islamists who were cultivated cautiously by Nazis and Fasi's to create trouble, first of all, against the British. And in their estimation, Muslims of both Arab and India as well had enough power, enough gumption to be able to divert much energy of the British in the war around the Second World War. So that was the calculation. And as a result, we see that in Germany, there are many such very, very prominent Islamists from all over the world, from many countries, who were gathered, such as Amin al-Husseini, who was called Mufti of Jerusalem, also called often Hitler's Mufti. Some time back, few years back, the Prime Minister of Israel, then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in a speech, he mentioned this Amin al-Husseini as the person who perhaps gave the idea to Hitler that instead of removing Jews physically from Germany and other countries that Nazis had won, to actually exterminate them, annihilate them. So this was Benjamin Netanyahu's estimation of Amin al-Husseini. We don't want to go too far into that, but suffices to say that al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was a pretty influential international Muslim leader. And just like a couple of decades back, around the World War I, there was a kind of interest and energy within the Muslim world for Khilafat to be protected. Around World War II, there was still something similar that was happening. And al-Husseini had more or less been the linchpin leader of that movement across countries. So you would go to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, many countries in Europe, Serbia, Turkey, and you would kind of try to create that international Islamist movement, renewing it from where they had left a couple of decades back. It is also this person, al-Husseini, who it must be mentioned, who was the inspiration in raising the Bosnian battalions. It was these Bosnian battalions that massacred Serbs. Every dark history in the Second World War, especially done on the non-Muslims by these Muslim fanatics. Another personality who was living in Germany as both arrived was Rashid Ali al-Gilani, the ex-Prime Minister of Iraq, whose credit it was to have led the so-called Farhud program of Iraq. This Farhud program was mass killing of Jews, almost like a riot in Iraq. And this person was in Germany, and those had to meet both al-Husseini and al-Gilani frequently, dine with them, impress them with these plans, etc. Shah Amanullah, another personality worth mentioning, he was the dethroned Sultan of Afghanistan. Interestingly, it was this person, Shah Amanullah, whom the Ali brothers had a couple of decades back in the 1919, around that time frame, had appealed to invade India. He was the Sultan of Afghanistan. So this Shah Amanullah was exiled. He was living in Europe, in Germany at this time. Sheikh Arslan, another very important personality of the time, who was from Lebanon, very staunch international pan-Islamist. Again, those are some examples to show how Nazi and Fatih powers were cultivating these jihad elements, these Islamists, as a strategic tool, perhaps also tactical tool, against the British in their Second World War efforts. And those, even before he made an entry in the picture in German calculations, there were many Indian jihadists who were there in Germany as well, Germany and Italy. So, for example, Fakir of EP, the so-called Fakir of EP of Waziristan, Inayatullah Khan al-Mashiki of Punjab, they were receiving much support from Nazis already before both reached Germany. The later Inayatullah Khan al-Mashriqi, he founded Khasar movement, and Inayatullah Khan al-Mashriqi was interestingly the first ever Indian, prominent Indian at least, who Hitler had ever met. Way back, almost 2 decades before both met Hitler, it was Mashriqi who had met Hitler in 1926. And it seems that Hitler and Mashriqi had stayed in contact even after that. And it was Mashriqi who, at least from his perspective, write in his biography, etc., that he impressed upon Hitler about the Muslims of India and so on and so forth. Anyways, what is interesting here before I move to the next part is a couple of things. One, RSS is much defamed by the leftist narratives as someone who was much impressed and much impressed by and much admiring the Hitler Nazis. Whereas we see in reality, these international Islamists, jihadis, were actual collaborators of Hitler and Nazis. In comparison to the so-called alleged RSS inspiration from Nazis, here you see actual operational strategic collaboration. And yet, in the narrative, Nazi collaboration with Islam is hardly a topic that is discussed. Just like Nazi collaboration with Church and the Pope is hardly discussed. This asymmetry is, however, something very important for us to remind ourselves. That's why I mentioned it. So, Bose, when he appeared in this whole creation of INA Azad Hind, we should remember that he was not the founder of either INA or Azad Hind. It is a misconception that he founded Azad Hind Fauj. He did not. Nor did he found INA. So there was another Indian Islamist named Iqbal Shai from Sialkot, Punjab, now in Pakistan, who was for many years before Bose living in Europe. He was chosen, very influential. He was chosen to be in the circle of influence of Mussolini. He would often meet with close relatives, including his younger brother of Mussolini. And he was running something like an India Center in Milan and then in Rome. He would meet even the Nazi officials, etc. And he was running this organization called Azad Hindustan, including a radio channel which was funded for him by the Nazis. This organization, Azad Hind, already existed. It was run by Shai. And Shai had this organization completely operating as the project of Islam. All the officials, activists, workers were Muslims, most of them very fanatical. Now Bose had to, in a way, compete with Shedai. So Shedai was in Italy, Bose was in Germany. Bose had to learn all these operations, all these, especially even the radio that Bose established later. He took technical help, operational help from Shedai. This Azad Hind radio that we had that used to be aired to India, and Indians would listen to the speeches of Bose on Azad Hind radio at least twice a week. All of that operation came from Azad Hindustan of Shedai. Another thing which Shedai was already doing was the prisoners of wars that were captured by the Germans and Italians in North Africa, in Turkey, in other theaters of war. Those prisoners of war would be camped in the outskirts of Germany, and Shedai or Azad Hindustan activists, they would try to convince these prisoners of war to desert and join the rebel army, independent army. So they would lure them with the salary and pension offers. They would also try to inspire them to fight for India. In case of Shedai, it was more about fighting for establishing Islamic rule in India, because if you go through the records of the Azad Hindustan, you would see that the rhetoric was more aligned towards an Islamist movement rather than liberation of India. Now, Shedai, this personality is much admired in Pakistan. Although it's digression, would like to mention that later, after independence, interestingly, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, the then Education Minister of India, went to Rome and met this person, Iqbal Shedai. Not only that, offered him a lucrative post in the government of India, perhaps making him even a minister in the cabinet. There is a letter or a telegram is available written by Maulana Azad to that effect. Shedai refused, said, "I'm Pakistani more than I'm Indian," and eventually moved to Lahore and so on and so forth. He is referred as the junior Iqbal. So the Allama Iqbal be senior Iqbal, Shedai is junior Iqbal. Seeds of the Azad Hind Fauj were these kind of Islamist tendencies through the leaders I mentioned before, such as Shedai, even before Bose had landed in Germany. After Subhas Bose appeared in Germany to try to do something bigger, of course, Bose had much bigger profile. He was president of Congress Party, the biggest party in India, and he was far more charismatic, far more influential. So we see that after Bose reached Germany, the prisoners of wars would start joining the Azad Hind far more. But still, we see that Bose very clearly mentioning in his speeches and in his writings, if we read carefully his documents of the time, the population of Muslims in the prisoners of war camps was far more. And what was the reason for that? After the rebellion of 1857 in the Indian Army, British Indian Army, British had consciously reduced the recruitment from the Hindu majority areas. Earlier, before 1857, for almost a century, British used to traditionally recruit from what is now Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or Bengal. After 1857, they stopped recruiting so much from these areas. They focused in Punjab, Waziristan, Baluchistan, etc. So according to the estimates, British Indian Army at the time of partition, transfer power, was almost 50% Hindu and 50% was non-Hindu, majority of which being Muslims, and perhaps two-thirds of that half being Muslim, one-third being Sikhs. I'm forced to count Sikhs separately here because that's how the British Army records too. That fact can be seen from so many facts. There is enough records available of the British Army officers who give us insights about not only this kind of communal population division, but also a lot of interesting events that highlight the motivation of Muslims even in British Indian Army. Many times being of what we are very familiar with, that Islam, loyalty to Islam being higher than loyalty to any other entity. Anyways, Bose mentions in his addresses, oftentimes almost like appealing to the Muslims of these prisoner camps. He would often use the kind of rhetoric that Muslims should do a great service, Muslim soldiers should do a great service to Islam by joining Azad Hind Fauj and fighting for removal of British, not for liberation of India. And Bose's object is liberation of India. But he's offering these Muslim soldiers of British army, prisoner camps in Germany, that by joining Azad Hind, you will do a service to Islam. By throwing out British, you will do service to Islam, etc. Interestingly, at least in one address that I found in the records of Radio Berlin that he spoke, where he almost like is equivocal about Pakistan. He says that Pakistan would be created under a national government, but as long as British are there, Pakistan will not get created. So Bose is talking language like this. You can imagine his compulsions. His compulsions, as I said and I will repeat, was number one, the Indian army was full of Muslims, and therefore these prisoners of war were full of Muslims. And the motivation of Muslims, no matter how much appeal to the liberation of India, etc., will be lukewarm. But if you motivate them for service to Islam, it will immediately create connection. So remember those things. He would Bose, in some of his speeches from Radio Berlin, interestingly, would criticize Hindu Mahasabha and Akalis very, very bitterly. Not so much the Muslim fanaticals. He would in fact criticize Jinnah sometimes, but not because he was fanatic, not because he was creating communalism. He would criticize Jinnah because Jinnah, he would say, was a collaborator of, let's say, capitalists, zamindars, and Jinnah was a collaborator with British who are against Islam. So he would try to question not the politics of Jinnah, not the sole Muslim spokesman stature of Jinnah. He would question Jinnah on the other side things. And you can imagine why. I already mentioned you should be a little sympathetic to Bose under the compulsion that he was. Now, there was a celebration in Germany on 26th of January 1943, where Bose organized the Indians of Germany and nearby places to meet and celebrate what was known as Indian Independence Day. Incidentally, 26th January is nothing to do with the 26th January of later. It is in 1943. You'd be surprised who Bose had to choose as chief guest. Bose invited the same Mufti of Hitler and the ex-Prime Minister of Iraq, the same fanatical Muslim personalities who I mentioned before, who Benjamin Netanyahu called as the man who inspired Hitler to kill off all the Jews rather than remove them from Europe. He was the chief guest of India's Independence Day in 1943, 26th of January, invited by Bose. And Subhas Bose would appear not in his traditional clothes, military clothes that he would wear, not also in the traditional Indian clothes which he would often wear, but in a sherwani, speaking in a language which would seem like addressing primarily the Muslims than anybody else. Large part of his speech, which is recorded, is dedicated to how badly the Muslims are placed and how Muslim League, etc., are not truly the representatives of Muslims. He would talk about how Muslims and Hindus are joining heads together under this Azad Hind for the liberation of common cause, etc. The reality was the number of Muslims in POWs, I mentioned, were more Muslims, less Hindus. But if you look at the population of Hindus and Muslims in the Azad Hind, at least in the Berlin times, when Bose was in Berlin, it was more than 60 to 65% Hindus. and remaining also were mostly Sikhs. There was less than 15% population within Azad Hind in Germany that was Muslim in Arbos. These estimates are available according to the documents of the time. So what I want to tell you is disproportionate amount of appeals, rhetoric, etc., which was created enticing Muslim soldiers to join, whereas it was actually Hindus who were part of the sacrifices that Azad Hind was making. What does it tell us? So let's pause for a moment in our narrative and draw some short conclusions. What does it tell us? If we are still not able to clearly see that a Muslim is a Muslim first, then you will keep repeating the mistakes which Bose made, Gandhi made, even political leaders of today make. We need to be absolutely clear, and it's not a derogatory statement to make against Muslims. It's not Islamophobic or anything like that. For Muslims, Islam is the first loyalty. Unfortunately, we, in our outdated model, outdated frame of reference of nationalism, do not realize that frame of thinking of Muslims is different. They are a civilizational citizen of Islam. They be in India, they be in Pakistan, they be in Turkey, they be in Europe. They are civilizational citizens of Islamic civilization. The nation-state model of thinking, the frame of reference is outdated. It was already outdated, now it is very clear that it doesn't even work anymore. Sooner, Hindus would also get rid of thinking so much how the 19th, 20th century way of thinking was, the better. It is a clash of civilizations, to use the references of Samuel Huntington. Clash of civilization, not clash of nations. You appeal for the nationalistic ideas. The other party, the other side, doesn't have nation state as the top priority for them. Civilization, which is based on the religion, is the framework. You have to realize that. Now, coming back, so many other things which we can see in the history of INA of the time, where things be done to placate Islamic sentiment, language being one thing. So the language of Azad Hind was not Hindi. There was in 1930s and especially 1930s, but continuing in 1940s, much debate about what should be the primary means of communication on a common platform at national level. And Hindi movement was in full swing. Netaji, and while he was Congress president, also later, more especially when he became the Sipah Salar of Azad Hind, he chose Urdu written in English letters, in Roman letters, as the national language of Azad Hind. All the documents, all the communique of Azad Hind was done in that language. It was done to placate the Islamic sentiment in. The motto that was adopted of Azad Hind Fauj was a pure Farsi. It said, Ittifaq, E'timad, Qurbani, unity, faith and sacrifice. Later, in Singapore, the government that set up, it was not called Indian National Government Exile or something like that. It was called Ardi Hukumat Azad Hind. The commands of the army were replaced, English and normal Hindi commands were replaced with Urdu commands. The title Bose took as the supreme commander of this Azad Hind Fauj was Sipah Salar. In all signatures you see in documents, you would sign with seal Sipah Salar. All the decorations that Azad Hind Fauj created were in Farsi as well. Sardar-e-Jang, Viko Hind, Tamgaye Bahaduri, Tamgaye Shatranash, Sher-Hind, Shaheed, etc. So the communique which the army units would send to each other all be written in almost 99% Urdu words, 1% being the remaining native words, written in English letters. Again, the newspaper which was published, Azad Hind from Singapore, it was published in this kind of language. The national anthem, very importantly, national anthem, of course, Vande Mataram was out of question. It was a communal song. But even Jan Gana Mana, noted down, Jan Gana Mana of Rabindranath Tagore was considered too much communal. It had too many Sanskrit words. So the 26th January 1943 celebration that I mentioned, often you read by many people, even in the official textbooks and narratives, that the national anthem, Jan Gana Mana, was sung for the first time on that occasion as the national anthem. Really is slightly different. It's half-truth. The song was not sung. Bose did not have the song sung. Only the tune was played by the orchestra. Because song had too much Sanskrit. It was communal. How can it be sung? Only the tune was played. So when you next time hear from any such narrative that Jan Gana Mana was sung by Bose in Germany, celebrating it was not. Only tune was played. And then when Netaji was coming to Singapore through the Japanese ship. It was on the ship that he asked his ADC, his name is Abi Ali, Captain Abi Ali, to translate Jana Gana Mana in what he called Hindustani. Hindustani being synonym of Urdu basically. Urdu seems communal word, so they used euphemism of Hindustani. But whenever you heard Hindustani language same as Urdu, just they don't want to refer to it as Urdu. Anyways, Rashid Ali translated Jana Gana Mana as almost a parody of that song, Sab Sukh Chain, and that is much touted as very patriotic song, etc. It is not even a shadow of Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore's Jana Gana Mana. Anyways, that was the Qawmi drama. So many other songs. Kadam kadam badhaye ja, Jindagi hai kaum ki kaum mein lutaye ja. So Urdu was preferred, and again primary compulsion was these Muslims. Anyway, let's move forward. So just like Azad Hind was originally created by Shedai, Bose reaching in Europe almost took over Azad Hind operation. Similarly, on advice of Hitler, Bose came to Eastern Theater in Asia. He reached Singapore, Southeast Asia. And here also this INA, Indian National Army, had already been created. You should always remember, Netaji, great leader that he was not founder of INA. He was leader of INA, he took over INA. INA was already founded some time back by the effort of Japanese. It's a very glorious history, we have to skip many things in that. But INA was already created. There was an army officer from the British Army, Sardar Mohan Singh, General Mohan Singh later, who was chosen to, just like in Europe, the prisoner of wars were lured into joining the operations against British. Same thing there. Under Captain Mohan Singh, later General Mohan Singh, the prisoners of wars were asked to rebel, join Japanese and fight for the freedom of India. If you compare the Nazi operation of doing that in Europe and Japanese operation of doing that in Singapore, you cannot but feel so sympathetic, so inspired, and so much admiring of the Japanese, quite honestly. There were unfortunately a lot of distrusts, there were a lot of operational challenges, it failed, but Japanese truly had the spirit of Asia for Asians, they had amazing amount of reverence for India, respect for India. They had therefore started this INA. As soon when INA organization started, many leaders from Malaysia, Thailand, Japan, they all came together in series of meetings and conferences. First one took place in Japan, the next one took place in Bangkok. They created a whole, not just army, but kind of a pseudo government setup under, and they unanimously chose the great leader Rash Bihari Bose or Ras Bihari Bose. Ras Bihari Bose was amazingly great leader who had migrated, who was forced to migrate to Japan decades back, who had settled down in Japan, and it was he who truly had inspired the creation of INA working with Japanese. Anyways, when Subhash Bose reached Singapore, he took over that Azad Hind. He named INA as Azad Hind Fauj. Fast forward few months as the operation started, the official narrative that I mentioned earlier, not just narrative, even the impression in the Indian psyche that Dillo, Sahgal, Shahnawaz, the trio, one Sikh, one Hindu, and one Muslim officer, together they were tried for treason by the British in the Red Fort of Delhi. And that kind of secular nationalism was the picture that was painted, that still is painted. One Muslim, one Sikh, one Hindu, Dillo, Sahgal, Shahnawaz trio. And beyond that, unfortunately, we don't even look at the reality. So, if we study the documents of the time, we can very, very clearly understand, number one, the motivation, especially Singapore, motivation for the Muslims to join the Azad Hind Fauj. So, we'll give 4 documentary evidences which are not mentioned by anybody. Don't they skip over all these evidences. First evidence I mention is the testimony in court of INA officer Captain Abdul Rashid Ali. He was as senior as Dillo, Sahgal and Shahnawaz in the British Indian Army and in INA as well. Later, when the court martials happened, when the INA lost and Japanese lost, British recaptured, and all these about 20,000 soldiers of INA, they were, not all of them, but they were taken back, they were dismissed from service, but many of them, to make example, tried, especially the officers, they were tried in court martial. And the testimonies, the proceedings, their defense arguments, those are all documented in the archives only if we want to read them. Most of them available only on internet in the British archives. So there is this testimony by Captain Abdul Rashid Ali during the court-martial in 1946. So he very clearly states that his objective in joining INA was single-folded. He wanted to serve Islam. He says, I wanted to safeguard Indian Muslims from getting dominated by the Hindus and Sikhs of INA. INA was full of Hindus and Sikhs. And I thought that they might be victorious. Japan might win because they did have early successes. Burma was captured. They reached all the way to Kohima and northeastern frontiers. Of course. So I joined INA to safeguard Muslims because dominated by Hindus and Sikhs. If they win, they reach India, they would harm the Muslim interests in India. This is a very senior officer of INA, Captain Abdul Rashid Ali, in his recorded court-martial statement. There is a newspaper report in a newspaper from Calcutta. It says, reading from a written statement, in a clear, ringing voice, Captain Ali declared, I was cut off from the rest of the world and could get only such news as was supplied by the Japanese. I was convinced that non-Muslims who were the moving spirit in the INA were going to invade India with the help of Japanese. I was also convinced that this would result in the domination of India by non-Muslims helped by the Japanese. Therefore, in order to safeguard the interests of my community, I decided, like the rest of the Muslims, to join the INA. Remember this, Muslim British officers are joining INA not for liberation of motherland, they are joining for safeguarding the interests of Islam. While the proportion of Muslims in Indian army was significant, proportion of Muslims in INA or Azad Hind was very small in comparison. So even those Muslims who would join for either serving the interest of Islam or indeed to subvert INA. In fact, the testimony of the court-martial, the testimony of Shahnawaz himself, Captain Shahnawaz, he mentions that I had joined INA before even Bose arrived in Singapore under Sardar Mohan Singh for the express purpose of sabotaging it. I wanted to sabotage that first INA. And it is later when Subhas Bose came and seeing his character, be impressed by his secularism, my heart changed and I became truly an INA soldier. That is what even he said. There is a lot of Chinese records, documents available, especially after 1920s. The Japanese war documents have become translated and available in English. There are some interesting written in recent times. One such book is about the founder of INA, Rash Bihari Bose, very recent, last year written. These throw light that many of the very senior INA officials, so for example, Lieutenant Colonel Gilani was a very senior officer who was given the charge by Rash Bihari Bose. I'm talking for Subhas Bose. Rash Bihari Bose, he was part of his cabinet, part of his administrative commission, and he was in charge of military training of the prisoners of war. He was part of the army strategy group as well. And this Gilani was later, along with his other officer, brother officer Mahmud Khan Durrani, they were decorated by British later. For what? For doing the counter-espionage by embedding themselves in INA and sabotaging it. So you can understand that INA secularism image needs to be seriously questioned. That was first evidence I mentioned. Second, there was another witness in the court-martial's documents. If you go through, there's a soldier whose name is Muhammad Hayat. He clearly mentions why he joined INA with a different pressure. He said interestingly in his court-martial testimony that Major Aziz Ahmad, another officer, Muslim officer, he came to our camps. He said that Sikhs and Hindus are complaining that you guys have slaughtered a cow. You captured a cow from the Burmese market, you slaughtered it, and they are very angry and they are going to murder you. So all the Muslims, because in the prisoner of war camps, we were segregated, we didn't know the reality. We came under pressure. We need to now join the INA so that we can get arms. Otherwise, Sikh and Hindu INA members already are armed. Our arms are taken away. So to defend ourselves when they come rioting, we need to have arms as well. So I joined INA. It tells you how recruiters applied this kind of communal pressures. So major, it doesn't reflect so much on this witness, but on the major Aziz Ahmad, who kind of created this camouflage. In reality, there was no such cow slaughter. In reality, there was not going to be any communal riot within the ranks. But this officer of INA, Muslim officer, knew the communal buttons he can press because those buttons work. That's the second. Then in 1945, just towards the end of the INA's heroic resistance, in Manipur and Burma, there were several instances of desertion, treachery, sabotage by INA own officers. So again, much of that is documented, but some of it is skipped. Why those treacheries were happening, those desertions were happening. So I read the diary of Colonel P.K. Sehgal, again available only if you want to read. So Colonel Sehgal was an eyewitness to those treacheries. He was in fact sent by Netaji to the ground to investigate as an investigating officer about why these treacheries are happening. And in the diary later, Colonel Sehgal writes 3 points. I will mention only the first. He says, Turkey's alignment alongside the anti-Axis powers has had a very adverse effect on certain Muslim officers. So, during the Second World War, Turkey had allied with Germany, just like they had even before. So, Turkey looked up to by the Indian Muslims as the land of Khalifa, if not de facto Khalifa. The direction politically that Turkey will take, we shall also take. Almost like the Communist Party of India saying that chairman now is our chairman as well. Whatever the Chinese Communist Party side is our stand as well. Something similar you can see, not just then, even now. The once again, civilizational loyalty, civilizational citizenship, not citizenship to a nation state, is what the Muslim framework is. You have to understand that. You have to learn from it. Anyway, continuing. In fight for efforts to explain to them the circumstances under which Turkey has been forced to join the war, the Muslim officers feel that by fighting against them, they are allied with the Turks. They are being disloyal to Islam. So they cannot take up arms against Turkey. By doing that, they will become disloyal to Islam. Therefore, the ditching INA also. Then he mentions further in his diary the desertion of one officer, Lieutenant Yasin Khan, and so on and so forth. That it had almost like cascading effect. Once these leading Muslim officers desert, it caused the moral collapse among the other officers as well. Even if these deserters are in minority, it would have a ripple effect. And that's what Captain Sehgal says. Now, this kind of desertions, this kind of rebellion is not new at all. Even around the World War I, when the Khilafat movement, in my previous talk, I mentioned briefly about that as well, how in Singapore and also in Europe, the Muslim British officers and soldiers often had rebelled. In Europe, they many times fought. They switched sides tonight and tomorrow started fighting against the British alongside the Turkish forces. In Singapore too, around the First World War, when Ali Brothers and Khilafat movement was at its raging peak, Muslim officers of Baloch regiment, etc., stationed in Singapore, had rebelled. They had killed many of their own brother soldiers, non-Muslims and British, and rebelled. So of that happened. And why only go that far? Throughout the history, Battle of Talikota, for example, the Battle of Vijayanagara, one of the primary reasons was that the Muslim soldiers, officers of Vijayanagara army deserted. They joined the other side, the invading side, and that's nothing new at all. If we think, we need to learn lessons rather than ignoring these kind of uncomfortable, unpalatable facts, or powers that be. Just learn some lessons. Otherwise, if you keep in the same belief that the prior leaders belabored, you would also face the same consequences that they did. Another INA officer, I should mention a few, what happened after INA collapsed. These Muslim officers who were in INA, of course, they would not be taken back by the British army. In fact, after independence also, the Indian leadership wisely decided never to employ INA force back into the army, but never given the arms again. Having all said and done, they had rebelled, and they had been indoctrinated in a certain way. So it was not wise to take them back into the army ranks, but Jinnah did. Pakistan, again, facts which we don't talk about much. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Muslim League very carefully and wisely, from their perspective, utilized these INA officers. Since they were unemployed, they would become the military advisors. Now, what military is required for Muslim League? You know that very well. But these soldiers and these officers, Muslim officers of INA, were hired, recruited actively by Muslim League. In the so-called youth wing, they would train the Muslim League youth, they would organize camps, they would train them in Punjab, all the way from Punjab to Bengal. And what would these youth do? You know that very well. So the whole communal violence, starting with the direct action day, all the way till after partition, I'm saying till well after partition, there's a much role that was played by these INA officers on Muslim League side. There's some mention as well that learning from this, the Akalis especially, as well, recruited some of the INA officers, Sikh INA officers, to train Khalid Tar as well in the military rigor. So we see mention of that from Jandhar, from Ludhiana, other places on the north side of Punjab. But the Sikh INA officers, of course, they were dismissed from service, so they would now become Jathedars of the Akali Jathas. They also mention that RSS we won't forget it, but there is also mention that RSS also, and Hindu Mahasabha for sure, openly took help of some of the Hindu INA officers as well to prepare and train Hindu youth too. Gorkha, especially, there is some police report mention that from Gorakhpur, the correspondence that the Nath head headquarters in Gorakhpur, they organized about 200 Gorkha soldiers and officers to go to Punjab and elsewhere, stay there for several months. There would be camps, which would be 2-3 month camps, which would be organized in mattas or temple premises, and Hindu youth, Sikh youth would also learn the military rigor. So all of that was happening. But I go back once again to few of these important personalities who, after the collapse of INA, helped Jinnah in a significant way. First is Brigadier Habibur Rahman. So those who know the history of Bose, who have read the life history of Netaji, would immediately recall that in the fateful flight in which supposedly Netaji died, I don't know whether he did or not, but in that flight he had taken one officer with him. So it was Netaji and the other officer. That other officer was Brigadier Habibur Rahman. And this Brigadier Habibur Rahman survived. He recuperated, returned to India, and immediately he joined Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He was the senior most military officer who joined Jinnah. And it was actually after, immediately after independence, when in 1947-48, Pakistan invaded Kashmir, the head of that operation was Habib Rahman. Even before that armed invasion, it was Habib Rahman and Muslim League delegates under his leadership who visited Srinagar, went to meet the Dogra Maharaja, Singh, to impress upon him to join Pakistan. Leader of that group was Habibur Rahman, same person who was right-hand man of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who was with him physically when the crash of that fateful flight happened. So I was trying to tell you what kind of personalities were involved in this jihadis of INA, which is why called the jihadi of INA. It was Habib Rahman who organized the Kabali training camps. So you could see that terrorism of that time was started by this jihadi of INA, Habibur Rahman. So there were so many of these INA officers who need mention, but Shahnawaz Khan himself deserves some mention. This secularist mindset of leadership, Indian leadership, Hindu leadership, just keeps biting us, and we don't even want to learn from it. So this officer, Shahnawaz, he was from Rawalpindi, Pakistan. Can you imagine Congress leadership, especially Nehru and other of his kind, they pleaded to him to stay back to India. Rawalpindi is going to Pakistan, but you stay back in India. He said, my whole family is there. He said, no, you stay back, I'll make you minister. And indeed, he stayed back. Shahnawaz, of this Dillo Shahnawaz fame, he stayed back. He was made a minister in the Congress cabinet. He served for many years. Surprisingly, when 1965 war happened, India-Pakistan 1965 war, his own son, Shahnawaz's son, was an officer in the Pakistan army, leading the troops across the border, invading India. And he was a cabinet minister in India in 1965 too. Can you imagine that situation? he was forced to resign by a lot of protests that happened, and he resigned. But that kind of craziness, you can imagine Aman ki Asha craziness, you can call it. Whereas the other party is absolutely abundantly clear about their objectives, about their ideology, about priorities. We, on the other hand, are visual thinkers who think that simply by nice sounding sentiments and slogans we can win the hearts, we can change the minds. No, we cannot. You are underestimating, perhaps you are misunderstanding the frame of reference, the mindset, the whole concept. This whole conflict is not a conflict of nationalism. You cannot say that I'm a nationalist and they are anti-Indians. That whole conversation, that whole thought is perhaps invalid. Your frame of reference is invalid. Think beyond the nations. That nation-state concept is gone. Even after that, the ideology concept is gone. Those who are familiar with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations will realize what I'm saying. The conflict of nations is finished. It's over. Conflict of ideologies like nationalism and communism, etc., is also over. Even Hindutva, I say, it's over. Now we are in a phase of clash of civilizations. No matter which color's passport you hold, no matter where you live on the globe, what matters is which civilization do you belong to. On this question, Muslims are clear. And I'm not bitter about it. I'm just telling you, Muslims are clear. They belong to Islamic civilization, which has a religious foundation. One of its pillar is its theology. They are absolutely crystal clear and they are even honest about it. They are transparent about it. Their loyalty is to Islam. They never lie about it. They say my loyalty to Islam. We, on the other hand, counter it with Indian nationalism or Hindutva, which is defined in geographic terms. That does not work. Apples and oranges. You need to also elevate, evolve beyond thinking yourself as a nation state or an ideology. You need to think yourself as citizens of a civilization. You may be in Bangladesh, you may be in Afghanistan, you may be in UK, Australia, or West, or India. Think in terms of civilizational citizenship. That's perhaps the last thing I would like to say to conclude my talk about jihadis of INA. Namaste. Thank you.
It was wonderful talk and very revealing, very like so many things we didn't know about INA. But like Rasbihari Bose had a background in Calcutta and he did a lot of work before he left for Japan. He had to leave for Japan. And even Subhash Chandra Bose and his family, they were deeply Hindu religious families, both of them. They conducted puja in his college and all that. So do you think this using Urdu and with the Muslims and all, do you think that it was a Congress effect, or do you think because Bahadur Shah Zafar was the last ruler, people somehow, all the leaders somehow felt that they had to stick to that kind of feeling to get all the people on board?
So, good question, and you are absolutely on the spot that Sarat Bose and Subhas Bose, their family, the Bose family, were very religious, very committed Hindu. In fact, Netaji Subhas Bose was deeply spiritual. He had, right from his childhood, from his youth, been a follower initially of Vedanta. Then he writes in his autobiography that once I had difficulty at some point with the Advaita, it didn't pause in me that I have to now look anything beyond Hindu sphere. I found other philosophies that suited my outlook. He was, even in his INA days in the Southeast Asia, he would often go to the temples and mathas. He would meditate for very, very long hours. He was a frequent visitor to some of the temples. He would do Kali Puja before any major political operation. It is said that a small copy of Bhagavad Gita was always on his left chest pocket of his military uniform. He would sleep with that under his pillow. He was a very religious Hindu, not only just a passive Hindu even. In his autobiography, he mentions how he argued with a Jesuit Christian missionary and he defeated him in an argument. He convinced him about the superiority of Shankara's Advaita or the hodgepodge of Christian theology. So you are absolutely right about that. Even his political guru of Netaji was Deshbandhu Babu Chittaranjan Das. Babu Chittaranjan Das himself was a very great Hindu, a religious Hindu. He was renowned for, he was a very wealthy person, he was barrister of his time. He would donate so much in the Hindu causes. His Haveli in Calcutta was always resounding with Kirtana. If you read the memoirs that are written by him and his friends, you would realize they are all very, very deeply committed, solid Hindus, no doubt about that, even one iota. I think perhaps the conundrum of this being deeply religious Hindu but still being secular is something that continues even today. The very good Hindus, rooted Hindus, not like the leftist deracinated folks, but deep-rooted Hindus can also be secular in their political outlook. In fact, if we leave emotions aside, our reverence and attachment to these praiseworthy leaders for a moment aside and be objective about it, you would see, let's go to, for example, Sindh. In Sindh, around the same time, there were great leaders like Sadhu Aswani and his guru. They, I'm not going to detail out how great service they did in so many things, right? Same, Vaswani ji wrote a book about Muhammad and Islam, and in that book he does all the typical whitewashing, all the typical lipaposi about Islam. This this conflict. In Gandhi, for example, do you think Gandhi was not good Hindu? Gandhi was solid Hindu. Gandhi was a very good Hindu. But secularism and Hinduism can go hand in hand. You're solid being a Hindu doesn't mean you will not be fooled by secularism. Tilak, even, I would say Tilak, even before Gandhi, even before Chiranjit Das, Tilak, in I think 1916, he did a pact with Jinnah in Lucknow, where he considered that yes, we'll have separate electorate for Muslims and separate for Hindus. It was Tilak who agreed, not Gandhi. Gandhi had not even appeared on the scene. Lokman Shri Balagangadhar Tilak, unfortunately, he agreed. There was a protest, he didn't protest, he agreed. So, being Hindu doesn't mean you will not be politically secular. If you are politically secular, then you will make all the mistakes of misjudging the intentions of Muslims, misjudging their priorities, and you will make these mistakes which all our leaders have been making so far. Long answer, hopefully that helps.
But I also want to ask you that even in 1857, the leaders wanted to fight under Bahadur Shah Zafar flag. So the Mughal effect was still there.
Yeah. So, fair enough. So, Bahadur Shah, so for example, even by the way, British proclamations considered Bahadur Shah Zafar their own head as well. All the military declarations I'm talking about, not commercial, all the military declarations, letters, everything, they will start with Kal Khuda Ka and all that. Mulk Sakara, etc. They deposed Bahadur Shah Zafar in 57, 58. Until then, even British at least used him as a figurehead. So Bahadur Shah Zafar being a figurehead, Marathas used him as a figurehead too. Marathas practically had displaced Mughal power in Delhi, but they did not physically move the Mughal seat. But Bahadur Shah Zafar was considered legitimate emperor of India. Even without power, he was considered legitimate emperor of India, not just by the Congress or these people, even British themselves, even Marathas, even everybody. So that was the reason why, at least for the 1857 independence movement, Zafar was used as figurehead.
Thank you. We had our previous speaker, Arvindji, over here for a while, and he has left a question. He says, this infiltration thing is long known. Why is this government after the Sabka Bakwas? I can't understand. Any little. So, why is the government after Sabka Bakwas?
On a serious note, though, I think it's a genuine belief that our leadership has always had and still has, that human nature by default is kind, generous. It responds to niceties from your side. You can win them over by gestures, etc. Sadly, it has been tried so many times and failed that if you try it so many more times, it will still fail. Unless you think that you are a greater person than Gandhi or Bose, who failed in at least giving appeasement to Muslim emotions and win them over to your side, their loyalty to your side. Failed, right? If you think if your leadership today thinks they are greater men, more visionaries, more charismatic than Gandhi and Bose, maybe they can try again. But my bet would be that has never worked and it will never work.
Sanjay Rishabh implies the same thing in his book, Breaking India. Doesn't say out so loud, but.
Okay. Sarveji, is a fascinating talk. And I do have a question, but I definitely say one or two small points in support of whatever you said. Sarveji?
Kindly, sir, please.
Yeah. This point you talked of Brigadier Habibur Rahman being military advisor to Jinnah. This confirmed by Akbar Khan. Brigadier Akbar Khan, who was then major, when he went into, when he got hold of these Lashkars from Afghanistan and the frontier province. He also takes his name, and what you have said is confirmed. Second, I also heard that Rash Bihari Bose and Chittaranjan Das were very much in favor of this Khilafat movement by Mahatma Gandhi. I don't know if it's really true, but this particular statement was made by a speaker some time back. Rash Bihari and Chittaranjan Das were very much in favor of the Khilafat movement and supported Gandhi in this. Is it true? Hindustani. Well, in the early 60s, I remember the Hindustani, as we call it. Now you said it's a slightly Indian from Urdu. It was very much fluent in the army. And all our racial books, weapon training, all that, I still remember, used to be in that Roman Hindustani. And it was normal, standard, accepted material for us as cadets to read. And from the Javans also. Just for information. Thank you.
No, thank you, sir. So, thank you for confirming Habibur Rahman's involvement. I have found some documents which detail out. It's surprising that he was in fact interviewed by many of the later commissions which were set up by the government of India to investigate into the disappearance / death of Netaji. And Habibur Rahman would be one person who was almost always interviewed in Pakistan. Thank you for confirming this collaboration with Jinnah around the Kashmir invasion, Kaili training, etc. The second point you mentioned was about Khilafat movement. So Sarat Bose, perhaps not Rash Bihari Bose, Sarat Bose for sure was solidly with Gandhi in Khilafat movement. But more than him, actually it was the brainchild, more or less, of Babu Chittaranjan Das that Congress should put its whole weight behind Khilafat movement. It was his brainchild, not Gandhi's. Gandhi was the poster boy. He was charismatic and he took leadership. But actually, behind screens, it was this Mr. Babu Chittaranjan Das whose idea it was that let us now suspend all other activity or energies to Khilafat movement. He had, even before Khilafat movement, actually, it was he, Chittaranjan Das, who had created so-called Hindu-Muslim Pact of Calcutta, where he said that all the districts in Bengal, undivided Bengal, where Muslims were more than 13%, they would be given certain seats and so on in government jobs. So this whole secularism was deeply ingrained in Babu Chittaranjan Das's politics since beginning. And both it's not Rash Bihari, Sharat Chandra Bose and Subhash Chandra Bose, the two brothers, they were his disciples. Rash Bihari was a far more senior person. Rash Bihari was a revolutionary who had to leave India after 1913 or so. He threw a bomb at the Viceroy, I think in 1910, 11, sometime like that. It was successful, very successful from the incineration standpoint. The Rash Bihari was never even captured by British. So he did that, then went to Kashi. He lived in Kashi. He could not go back to Bengal too much. He went back to Banaras. He set up himself there. He trained a few revolutionaries. And then he disappeared. He eventually went to Japan. He settled down there. He was in constant touch, especially after Savarkar came out of prison. He was in touch with Savarkar, in correspondence with him. Rash Bihari even set up Hindu Mahasabha, the international chapter in Southeast Asia. He set up Hindu Mahasabha. He was the Ghadar party, that was Hindu German revolutionaries, or the Ghadar party, which happened in 1915, around that time, headquartered in California. Rash Bihari Bose was inspiration for that. At that time, he was already in Japan. So Japan being closer from time zone standpoint, correspondence standpoint, was prime motivation behind the Ghadar party, and especially the so-called Hindu-German conspiracy, as the British call it, where he procured and helped the revolutionaries in India procure good quality ammunitions, etc. from Germany. So all of that was Rash Bihari Bose. I have to go back and check what was his stand on Khilafat, but I'd be very surprised if he supported Khilafat. But definitely Sharat Bose and Subhash Bose, along with their Guji, that is Chittaranjan Das, they were prime movers in Khilafat. And third one, sir, Hindustani, you're right. So the British Indian Army, as the East India Company time itself, when they set up their small units in Bengal, etc. Bengal Infantry was the first one that they created. Of course, they had a very small number of British officers they recruited locally. Now, the communication language, if you go back to late 1700s, early 1800s, the preferred communication language which the British army found useful was Urdu language. It was not called Urdu, they called Hindustani. So if you look at the army dictionaries, etc., that were created by India Company, and then Calcutta College, etc., that founded. The ICS officers, even what we call IAS, was called ICS back then. So the Britishers who used to get successful in that exam, they became district magistrates, captors, etc. in India, young 20-something folks, would be trained in Indian language. They have to come here with some basic communication skill. So the language that they were taught was what we can call Urdu. The terminology was 100% Urdu only, but they call it Urdu, they called it Hindustani. So I'm not surprised that even Indian Army continued that legacy. But nowadays, however, sir, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I see a lot of commands, especially in the border security forces, police forces of different states, like UP police, I have seen it. The commands are more Hindi, Sanskrit kind of commands. Not so much, Urdu words prevalent in those commands now.
Sir, I have a point to add. I think it was Farsi initially for all official work when the British were here. And for a long time, even after that, continued in Farsi. And it's so much so that even Calcutta, West Bengal, government officers had to learn Farsi and communicate in Farsi. Not to do so much.
No. So it was just transition time. So Farsi was the court language of the Mughal court, right? Up to around 1800, Farsi was the you're absolutely. Farsi was what is English today. Okay, that was Farsi. So not so. Don't think it was just Muslims. Even Hindus, Asthas, Brahmins who will do the clerical or court jobs would all learn Farsi. So people, Farsi was well known actually. So people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for example, he was a Farsi scholar as well. He knew Farsi very well. A lot of Hindus would be Parsi scholars.
And for a long time, it continued as in England with French and English. Urdu was still a common man's language, so much so that even in the 1800s, poets like Mir and Ghaib wrote ke to Urdu hai, or like Urdu is kind of a common man's language, Farsi is more elite.
My question is that I was reading a few British and as well as Indian books that stated that when Mangal Pandey revolted against Britishers regarding the cartridge issues, then when he was attacking the British officer, there was a co-spy of his named Sheikh Paltu. So he was the one who jumped on Mangal Pandey and then he held him down, and that's how he got arrested. So my question here is that put up a question in my mind. Was this the reason later on that Bahadur Shah Zafar was chosen as the king during the 1857 war? Because they wanted to play the Islam angle and get the Muslim soldiers in the army towards their side.
Partly correct. Some of this was calculated and articulate, well thought out process in the mind, especially Nanaji, etc., who were actually more powerful than Bahadur Shah. Why would they choose Bahadur Shah as their supreme leader? So part of the calculation was this only, that if you don't choose him as the Sultan, as the overall emperor, then the Muslim presence in the army, that portion of the army, would be against you, and in general populace would rise up against you. That was at least their calculation. Right or wrong is a different thing, but that was possibly their calculation in keeping Bahadur Shah Zafar as it is. But there are more reasons than that in keeping Bahadur Shah Zafar as we figured beyond this also. I think one was, like I said, legitimacy. So you may perhaps find hard to imagine the mindset of those times, but it was considered even by Marathas, by Rajputs, others, that it's a sacred seat of power. It is a legitimate empire, and even though you might fight with it, even though you might wrestle with it and negotiate with it, gain and wrench powers from it, you should not dismantle it. And there is a lot more to be said there. That is perhaps just a caricature of thought. There may be some superstition also involved here. Nobody, no Hindu had truly been successful on the seat of Delhi when the great Prithviraj. So there is some superstition involved as well in ruling from Delhi, being the emperor in Delhi. I mean, when he took the seat of his grandfather, maternal grandfather, you see, he came asking when the other Hindu, Hemchara Vikramaditya, after defeating the early Mughals, he crowned himself Samrat Vikramaditya in Delhi. What happened to him? You know that. So there might be some superstition as well in the minds. Let these people be just as a puppet, just as figurehead, while the real power anyway will be with us. So many reasons involved here, Tanyaji.
Suresh, in the beginning, you said that R.C. Majumdar has quoted the INA. Before INA, the freedom movement had almost come to a standstill. What about Jantar and Anushilan? Those were in Bengal, because the British came here like 100 years before they went to Delhi. The freedom movement was very much thriving at that time.
That is correct.
Could you comment on that?
No, absolutely right. So it's a very glorious age of Indian history, that starting with 1890s. Okay, that's when I call it the revival of Hindu national spirit, Indian national spirit, peaking at around 1915. So the 25 years from 1890 to 1915 are revolutionary years. Revolutionary not just in political sense, in cultural, literary, art, every field. So you are absolutely right. Gandhara Samiti, Anushilan Samiti, all these, and then inspired by them outside Bengal also. You see Punjab, Maharashtra, and UP. There's so many revolutionaries that are doing their work. The whole of 1910s, 20s, and up to the middle of 1930s with Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad, and before that Ram Sadismil, before that Khudiram Bose. This whole about 15, 20 years of revolutionary activity was absolutely amazingly successful. No doubt about that. This is what had shaken British to begin with, and in some crooked way, this is what had also given rise to Gandhi's popularity. Seeing that, okay, you don't give an alternative to the Indians of expressing their politics, these revolutionaries will only go from strength to strength. So, while not undermining the superior intelligence network and brilliance that the British police had, don't undermine that, and the kind of hard dharmiya that the British had to rule, you don't undermine that, but perhaps giving more limelight to Gandhi and his politics was perhaps a calculated move by the British to undermine the popularity of these revolutionaries. Yeah, you are right. But come 1942 is when the Quit India movement happened. After Quit India movement, everything was quiet. There was nothing. Gandhi was left with thing. The outside of textbooks of your school, of our school, if you look at newspapers, if you look at the things which were happening at that time, it was all about Pakistan creation or opposing it. It was all about what will happen after independence, what is happening, World War II after effects, all of that. There was this famine and there was a lot of other things. But independence movement was over, finished. Gandhi was not doing anything after 1942. Therefore, Majumdar says that after 1942, independence movement was done. After that, it is INA which really once again aroused Indians. 1943, 44, 45. It was INA. Technology was available. Every sea corner had radio. You had a lot of people who had returned from abroad. There was a lot of expatriate population that had come back to India, and they would be colleges. There would be conversations everywhere. So after 1942, truly the independence movement was more or less led by INA. That's what R.S. Majumdar meant there.
Could you please give name of some good books like historians that would we can go to regarding these?
Regarding INA history,
The independence movement, the later independence movement.
there is a lot of work done, especially by Professor R.S. Majumdar and his team. So interesting to mention that in 1957, after independence, 1957, just a couple of years before 57, R.C. Majumdar, who was at that time the head of Indian Council of Historical Research, he was professor of history, perhaps the best historian Indians have produced in the last 200 years, let's say. He approached the government of India that 1857's centenary is coming a couple of years from now. So we should collaborate across the universities of India and rewrite the history of the independence movement. And they started writing. So about 20 universities collaborated under his leadership, ranging from Banaras Hindu University to Osmania University to Delhi University, etc. The history department, they started working together, and very detailed regional, local narratives of the independence movement. Every, not just state, every city, how they contributed, who were the personalities, that level of detail. When the reports were prepared, the first volume, second volume started coming. The Ministry of Human Development, led by Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, they curtailed the effect. The whole effort was thrown into the water. They said they are not going to publish these. And later, so book publishing was not cheap. It requires money. So later, the wife of late Professor R.S. Majumdar writes in one of those first editions of a book that he wrote, History of the Independence Movement of India. In the introduction and preface, the wife writes how, with difficulty, once the government refused, Professor Majumdar completed the work himself and published it at his own cost. Okay, so Professor Majumdar's, if you want to read one book only, then perhaps Professor Majumdar's work would be that. There were other books also. I should give credit to Sayyid Atar Abbas Rizvi as well, earlier of Aligarh Muslim University. Although being from Aligarh Muslim University, he is very unbiased, very honest, upright historian. He wrote works about the independence movement as well. And he openly bears some of the jihadi details of the independence movement. He's not ashamed of mentioning them. So, especially independence movement in the United Provinces, I think that's the title. It's a good book as well. There are other books. Savarkar's book about independence movement of 1857 is still monument.
Unmuted now.
He's not as much. But I'm surprised that people think, why are Muslim being upgraded so far as martial quality are concerned? But I just want to say this much, that this has been a practice from the days of Muhammad. When he said movements are as good as 10 kufr. And recently, you read the books of generals from Pakistan, like Ayub Khan, Friends Not Masters. He talks of Hindus and Banyas. You know, Indians are basically on the Banyas. And who will fall the moment you give them a little push. Bhutto said something about teaching the Hindu bastard the lesson. Now that we have got atomic weapons. Reza Khan used similar language that Hindus were very poor soldiers and could be pushed down in no time. Musharraf had no different opinions either. So right through the history has been coming that a Muslim is a better soldier than a Hindu. And therefore I am not surprised if people even today think that the Muslim is better at winning a weapon than a soft Hindu. And experience of our political bigwigs confirms this view. But it is still the view of the general public that a Muslim is a better soldier than a Hindu. That is what it is. That's from my way of looking at it. Thank you.
I agree with you, sir. I think you have very rightly articulated that impression, of course wrong, but that impression remains in the powers that be even today. So
So, Suresh, if you get tired, please let me know. But there's a last two questions. One is, why did the British not trust Habibur Rahman's statement as he was the sole eyewitness of the Haji death?
Which statement did not trust? Did not.
Like they did not trust that he had died in Taipei.
They had reasons not to trust him, right? He was, first of all, he was a deserter. He had rebelled against their employer, the British Army. So there is no reason for them to trust him. And the other was that, again, that's a different topic about Netaji's disappearance and all, but it was a very common belief. It was not just government, but in people believed that it was just a feigned death. It was not a real death. Netaji had done that to buy some time. He has disappeared with a lot of money and resources. He'll strike back, come back, etc. That was a common belief. So perhaps British also believe that. Thank you. Namaste. Thanks for your patience.